what does that mean? Well, you put it together with Peter and you put it together with Genesis, it seems to be talking about the sons of God. My first reaction was, I don't like that. This seems to be a little embarrassing, but it's the best interpretation. It's the one that makes the most sense in terms of literary analysis. And I'm going to let everybody else figure out how to deal with that, because I don't know how to deal with that. All I know how to deal with is how to interpret the text and let other people worry about what the ramifications are.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast. I am the layman, and I'm here with the scholar himself, Mark Chavalas. And you can see we're in a little bit of a different setup. We're doing a virtual one today to kick off our new series. That's because we are currently undergoing some work for a brand new spiffy little studio for the podcast. So that will be exciting. But that's currently under construction. So we are doing this virtual. I'm at my house, Mark's at his, and we miss each other dearly. Isn't that right, Mark?
Well, yeah, in fact, I'm at an undisclosed location about 300 or 400 feet underground.
Yeah, there
I
you
think.
go. You're in your Mesopotamian bunker.
Perhaps, yes.
Well,
Classic.
awesome. Yeah, so today we are excited to be kicking off a new series where we will be talking about the Nephilim. So who are these Nephilim? Talk about fallen angels. Are they hybrid people? We'll maybe discuss some of like the Sethite view. Are they just giants? Who are these Nephilim? And so super fascinating topic. I know I'm very excited and eager to learn. So we will be looking at Genesis 6 today. And so Mark, as always, I know you're a man of many answers. So who are the Nephilim?
Well, first, you forgot outer space aliens. And so at some point, I want to talk about the Anunnaki, which is a Mesopotamian term, divine beings. This will be a little bit later. And of course, about the planet Nibiru, which evidently has become really popular. And by the way, it's actually not a real planet, but that's another issue. Or put it this way, it's not a particular planet. But anyway, so why do I even deal with this? By the way, I have avoided Genesis 6, the first four, I suppose you could even say 5 verses, um, for most of my life, and had little or no interest in it. People would ask me about it. I said, oh, it's just a fragment of a text, um, not really leading to anything. And so I'd rather just avoid it. And so I would always have a pat answer like, oh, I don't know. It could be something literary about, sons of God, daughters of men, might be poetic about, the traditional view, since really, I suppose in Christian tradition, since Augustine in the 5th century, and in the Jewish tradition, probably about the 3rd century AD, they've tried to rationalize this and demythologize it. And I thought, and without studying it carefully, it's like, oh, this is, yeah, I'll just go with that, no problem. Um, Problem is I've got kids, and one of my sons, asked me about the Nephilim, and I said, oh, and I basically sort of rambled on just like I did right now with no content. He says, Dad, you're wrong. I said, really? I've been studying this for a long time. How do you know I'm wrong? Well, you should look at this and that and this and that. And then you should look at, what it says in the New Testament about these things. And I said, yeah, actually, that kind of makes me uncomfortable. And that's why I've avoided it. Well, you should look into it, because you're wrong. And I have to admit that I had to go back to this particular child with a crow in my mouth because I had been eating crow. And I said, yeah, actually, buddy, uh, you're right. And I wasn't looking at this, but the reason that you're right is because of Mesopotamia. So I'm going to eventually get there. It probably won't be today, but I'm going to start. I'm going to really try to set the groundwork. For those of you who are really hot into this topic, this probably will sort of drive you crazy. But if I don't present my method in having to deal with this, it's not going to make sense, but it's also going to probably upset some people that I'm not going in the direction that they want me to go. All I can go is the only direction that I know. And again, like everything else, this is a work in progress. And so tomorrow I might learn something new. Um, and so maybe the best thing to do is just read the passage. Okay, we're going to look at Genesis 6. I happen to have a New American Standard with me, which I like. I don't find any of them particularly perfect or ideal, but this, I think, one works. And so here we are. Now, what just happened? You look at Genesis 4 and 5, which I've omitted, and at some point we're going to go back to them, but I just felt like doing this. And so we've had a genealogy, which in genealogies, by the way, though they're sort of boring for us, they were extremely important in the ancient Near Eastern world because it sets the stage for context. The fellows that worked with us in Syria, they all knew exactly their personal relationship with everybody in their area, even in their village. And so I would know, yeah, you are the son of my cousin once removed. And so I know you're part, so your family. And I would know exactly that it's on the paternal side, not the maternal side. And so they would actually, they have verbal genealogies like this. And I think I might have mentioned this already. I had one worker who could rattle off names of 30 of his fathers. And when he asked me, I could rattle off three. He wasn't terribly impressed. And of course, I felt like crawling into a hole after that. Um, because I didn't have a good understanding of my personal past. So we have all these genealogies, and then all of a sudden, when you start with verse 6, it's a really good divider. It says, now it came about. And so, in other words, this is basically topic change, mood change. If this is a movie, the whole screen is changed, the weather is changed, and oh, something new is going to happen right now. And it simply says, when men began to multiply on the face of the lands and daughters were born to them. By the way, it's almost a meaningless statement, except all they're saying is when people start procreating, uh, you won't believe what happened. That the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they choose. The writer is truncating something, and and so it tells me a lot. It tells me that whoever is writing this, and I know I'm going to say Moses, but we're going to do something on authorship one of these days. But I would rather reel a lot of you in before I do that, because I think when I start talking about authorship, it's going to explode some things. By the way, authorship is still divinely inspired, in my opinion, so don't worry about that. So anyway, the assumption is the listener here obviously knows what they're talking about. They're not going to elaborate on this because I've got a host of questions. What are you talking about? The term sons of God is that term for God is the Elohim term, and a son of God in the Bible almost always is talking about a heavenly being. And if it's an earthly being, it means they're describing them in the context of being like a heavenly being. And so a heavenly being is a heavenly being. Okay. Is it an angel? Is it what is it? I I couldn't tell you other than the fact that these are heavenly beings, and it says that heavenly beings saw the daughters of men were beautiful. So, and of course, men here just probably just means generically. In other words, human daughters. In other words, heavenly heavenly beings saw that human daughters were beautiful, comely, whatever, and they took wives from themselves. And of course, you got a million questions like, how on earth does this work? Did they come down and trick them? Did they, I mean, did they come in the form of human beings? You know, what does this mean? I, I've got a host of questions. Uh, I wish that people would stop and say, all right, I got a lot of questions. It doesn't appear that this text is going to answer it for me, because if I start trying to answer it when there's nothing obvious, I'm going to get in trouble, and I'm going to make a lot of incorrect conclusions and decisions. And so right now the jury's out. I don't know what this means. I don't know how this works. Uh, and it also means that the writer is not particularly interested in answering that query, like, how does this work? And now, of course, the the next thing to ask is, wait a minute, angelic beings, they can't procreate, can they? And of course, if you go to the New Testament, when Jesus has that one verse about, oh yeah, angels in heaven, they don't procreate. He doesn't say they can't. He just says they don't. Okay, so evidently, the need for procreation is unnecessary in the heavenly realm. It is necessary in our earthly realm, so we fill the earth. Okay, and so evidently, that's the primary reason for procreation. If you simply read Genesis 1 and you don't have anything else to do. So let's just take this at face value for a few minutes and just assume that these must be heavenly beings, and heavenly beings are procreating with human beings. Now, of course, that already goes against my uh, 17th century rationalistic worldview. Like, wait a minute, that doesn't fly with me. Of course, my sarcastic retort is, yeah, I suppose this is just as irrational as believing in that God could become human, or he could take on human flesh and then resurrect from the dead. Um, that would be easier than this. No, not at all. And so, in other words, this is another one of those mysterious things. And so, let's just take it at face value for a few minutes and see where it leads us. Um, and by the way, this is the thing that was really unpleasant with me. It would be kind of like for me getting on top of going on a roller coaster and I'm ready to go down. It's like, wait a minute, no, I really don't feel like doing this. But once I ended up doing this, it's like, okay, I guess I'm better off. I can say I did it. So, so God evidently pays attention to this in verse 3. And God says, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he is also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. It's like, so what does that have to do with what just happened? Again, here I am with my thinking brain. I'm thinking, it doesn't seem to be a one-to-one correspondence. And so I could quickly say something like, well, that doesn't make sense. So that's a fragment of a text and somebody made a mistake. Or maybe I better delve into this a little bit more to try and figure out, how does verse 3 connect with verse 2? And then how does verse 4 connect with these others too? Because all of a sudden it's like, oh, by the way, there's Nephilim on the earth, and we got to figure out who these guys are. And in those days, and also afterwards. So after what? I guess after what's coming up, and of course we're going to be having the flood narrative in a couple of verses, and so maybe that's the guess here. But of course that's troubling, and I know you got this question that you want to ask that everybody else is out there going to want to ask, and you're not going to be happy with my answer. Um, but but clearly verse 4 goes back to verse 2, because um, it says, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. I think that's referring to verse 2. And remember, this is something being, though it's written down, it's being transmitted orally to a people group. And this is why there's so much repetition. So when you hear this, it's like, oh yeah, I just heard that. It's, what happens when you hear the repetition? It's sort of cemented into your brain. And so you're hearing that, and they bore to them that the word children isn't there, but it's obvious. What do you bear? Of course, I don't know what happens when heavenly beings, procreate with human beings. I'm going to guess they're children. And those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. It Even though it's a bit of a mental stretch, I think there's no doubt who the products of that reunion are. It must be the Nephilim. Okay. And that's traditionally how it's been assumed over, centuries, at least the beginning centuries. There was no doubt about this, by the way. In fact, most of what I'm going to be telling you will have been traditional Christian and Jewish interpretation of the first couple centuries of our era, and also in Jewish interpretation in the past. And of course, I've got some text that inform on that. So let's just try and work through that. And it says they were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. The term there, mighty men, by the way, or men of renown, can be used. Well, it's like, I don't know. I suppose that it would be like calling somebody in a sports a superstar, and you're thinking, well, okay, well, what is a superstar? Can you imagine somebody in 5024 trying to figure all that the sports lingo out? A superstar. What is that? Is he a heavenly being? Is that why he played so well? Because he's better than everybody else? And of course, we would jokingly say, yeah, probably. Yeah, they're heavenly beings, or whatever. LeBron, he must have been a heavenly being until he got a little bit older, or whatever it is. And then people are calling them goat. You're thinking, I don't, why do they call him a goat? Um, um, so, so that doesn't help me in terms of explain whether these guys are earthly or heavenly. And we'll deal with that a little bit later on. So, but clearly this is a preface to the flood because of course, God then responds in 5, he saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intent of the thoughts were only evil. And that's the immediate reason for the flood narrative that comes up in the next verse. And we will talk about the flood at some point. Actually, I want to talk about the Mesopotamian flood more than the biblical flood to make connections. But the point is, here we are. This is clearly a prelude to the flood. And the Nephilim aren't just some random statement. Oh, by the way, hey, if you guys ever heard of the Nephilim, plug them in here. No, they're because I really think that the listener is saying, "Oh yeah, I know all about those guys." Why do they know about them? Evidently from Jewish tradition. The Bible's the Bible. This is what God chose to present to us as the best of the writings that would be handed down from generation to generation. It doesn't mean there isn't any other information. It just means this was the stuff that would be authoritative. That's why, for example, if we found a third letter of Paul, that would be really cool, but I wouldn't add it to the Bible just because it was the third letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. And so, um, for whatever reason, it didn't get there. So who are these guys? Um, uh, Now I'm not a Hebrew scholar, and I know I've mentioned that many times. And yes, I have heard of Mike Heiser. I've talked about him before. I respect him very highly, and in fact, my son said, Mike, why don't you look at his stuff? I said, okay, fine. And once I saw that Mike was talking about Mesopotamian stuff, he was scratching the surface. I said, well, I can go deeper than that. I better start looking at this stuff. I said, all right, grudgingly, um, you know, um, I can look at this. The Nephilim have been traditionally looked upon as possibly a Hebrew root that means fallen ones. Um, but Mike is the one to talk about the fact that there is also an Aramaic root uh, uh, concerning giant. And it is very interesting and telling that when the Greek writers of the Old Testament, the Septuagint translators, when they took the term here for Nephilim, they used the Greek word gigantes, giants. Okay, so they must have known what they were talking about. And of course, Aramaic, and of course, these are Jewish writers who were probably very well versed with their first language was probably Aramaic. That's probably where what they bought their bread with and sang lullabies to their kids. And that Hebrew would have been their church language, and Greek would have been, of course, the language they used with the rest of the world. And so when they were trying to figure out what term do I use for this term to translate our Bible, they used the word giants. They probably knew what they were talking about. They usually do, by the way. Of course, the problem is for scholars of the ancient world, that means you've got to be well versed in classical Greek, Aramaic/Syriac, biblical Hebrew, and then any other languages, and that of course nobody can be an expert on all that, and so I've got to rely on people, and 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 by the way, when Mike did this, he was relying on pointy-headed scholars who uh, knew what they were talking about. In fact, whenever I would look at Mike's book, and of course I'm talking about his unseen realm here, Um, Whenever he would make a citation, I'd say, "Fine, Mike, I'm going to go look at it," and I would go look at the citation myself and say, "Yeah, I think you got that right." And then I would delve into that, and then I'd forget about him. It's all right, fine. That was a nice starting point, buddy. So let me move on to this. So anyway, I know I'm babbling on, but the fact is, let's just take this at face value. It looks as if it's saying that the products of the heavenly beings and the earthly beings are the giants, the Nephilim, okay, the men of renown, whatever. I think that's pretty much at face value. I, I, whenever I've looked at commentators who've tried to make the argument otherwise, they've got to jump through a lot of hoops to get past what may be the unpleasant conclusion that this is what the biblical writer is talking about. So I'm just going to go there and see where it leads me. Now I know I'm going to anticipate your next question, unless you want to ask it about the flood, because it looks as if it's saying they were there before the flood and they were there afterwards. I guess that means they were there before the flood and afterwards. I suppose you could do some mental gymnastic and say, yeah, they were there before the flood and they got snuffed out. And all of a sudden they started up again and they started procreating again after the flood. And I'm thinking that seems to beg the whole question, like, what was the whole purpose of the flood then? But other than to start the process of removing them. And so, what does that mean about the flood? Um, Whether it was a universal flood. My first comment is, I don't think the writer gives a hoot about your question. That's my first thought. But be that as it may, since somebody out there might have a problem with that, um, and if you actually think I have an answer for you, you got another thing coming. But it's a great question. I don't know. And I think I've said this in other contexts. You know, the the Hebrew conception of the earth is certainly very different than ours, and so they would not have understood either its circular nature, nor would they have understood how much bigger it really is. So were they aware of anything past their general surroundings in the ancient Near Eastern slash Mediterranean world? No, and by the way, that doesn't mean the text isn't divinely inspired. God is speaking to a group of people who only understand a certain amount, kind of like us, if you think about it. And so, again, when we get to heaven, God's going to pat us on the back and say, that was a really good try. But in terms of eternity, that was a very immature try to answer this. And so I'm not going to be dogmatic about this. I think that we've created an inconsistency here because we've set up an interpretive mode that we now can't get out of. The flood is universal. So, and why? Because it said that the flood was throughout the whole earth. So it's either throughout their whole earth, or it's, of course, literary hyperbole, which is always a possibility, a figure of speech, or you have to go through some mental gymnastics to argue, yeah, the Nephilim were there, then they got snuffed out, and they started up again, which is, if you think about it, sort of preposterous because you're really reading between the lines to figure that one out, but you're doing it to make your general interpretation correct. I'd rather live with the tension than to try to figure this out for you. I don't know how to figure it out. And so that I'm if it's unsatisfactory, then I'm going to get the prize for that.
Yeah, because then wouldn't the one argument in terms of how they were before and I mean, there's multiple, but one that I've heard is because it's kind of going back more into like the book of Enoch, which would be the Watchers
Enoch.
and
Oh my
I know,
goodness.
a whole other thing.
Yes.
But then right, so the Watchers or these fallen angels, well, if they didn't die in it, then they could have done it again. But then it kind of goes back to what you had said earlier of if God wipes out mankind with a flood and then didn't see it coming that they would just do it again, then what was the point of the flood?
Yeah. And so I think we don't like the tension, so we want to resolve it. And by the way, I'm the same way, and I was the same way for a really, really long time, and I think I still am. And I've tried to learn to live with theological and interpretive tension when I can't easily resolve it, because I think it's more authentic to live with the tension, especially when I'm talking to people who are not of faith yet and they really want honest, difficult answers. I think I made the biggest impact. I think I might have mentioned this before with my atheist colleagues when they would ask me hard questions about Jesus and history. And I said, yeah, I don't know the answer to that one. And they thought, oh, you're actually being honest with me? I thought you were supposed to, give me a pat answer for everything. I said, "No, I'm gonna tell you I don't know how to answer that one, but it's not affecting my personal relationship with God because I can't figure it out. My faith is not based on my mental powers of interpretation. It's based upon God, and so I'm gonna live with the tension, and I don't know, so I don't know how
Yeah.
to respond to that. I just don't.
Yeah. And so, obviously, with this episode being the question, which is who are the Nephilim? I know you like the tension and living there, but based on your study and your understanding, and also the way that you're approaching it, looking through this Mesopotamian lens, of the camps that are out there and the options, what do you see as the most, and you've kind of mentioned a little bit, but in case people haven't picked up on it, like what do you see as the most valid uh, interpretation of who the Nephilim really are?
Clearly space aliens. All right, now I'm gonna drop the mic and go on. I'm sorry. I'm gonna get in trouble for that, I know, so if you're gonna make comments, go ahead, that'll help us, I'm sure. No, I suppose if you wanna call them hybrids because it sort of says they're products of heavenly beings and earthly beings. Whatever the product of a heavenly being and an earthly being is, it must be, well, I guess they're called Nephilim. And how does that work? I don't have the slightest idea, but if you look at ancient Near Eastern uh, context for this. This fits in perfectly with Mesopotamian and, by the way, also classical sources concerning the intermingling of heavenly and human. And so this is this. So in other words, there's nothing particularly unique about this passage in the context of the ancient Near Eastern world. So I'll talk with secular scholars about Genesis 6, and it's like, oh yeah, that means, in other words, I'm going to give you the garden variety sketch as to what this means if you're talking to a secular scholar who couldn't care less about it in terms of a faith tradition. In other words, they don't have a theological dog in the fight, and they would probably agree with most of what I'm going to bring up. They would probably quibble with details because that's what you do when you're scholars. But but the overall one, they probably wouldn't quibble with. And so whatever the product of a heavenly being and earthly being is, that's what those guys are. If you want to call it hybrid, that's fine. I have no idea how to explain it any further than that. But that's where I suppose where I would stand if I'm supposed to stand somewhere.
Yeah, at least subtly stand there.
Yeah.
But then even if that's your interpretation, so going back to this flood, then how do you reconcile whether or not universal, not universal? Like it's still taking place where the Nephilim are. So how are they before and after? What, they find a log, they're giant so they can swim for a long time? Like I'm just it's like you have to reconcile it regardless of what stance you're on a little bit.
Since the writer is not anticipating that question, it's not that I don't care about the answer. I'm simply going to tell you that the Bible isn't going to inform us about that answer. And so I'm going to let others try and figure that out. I don't have a clue. I don't know what that means. And so I'm not going to try to rationalize it. I know that maybe it's even the pastoral heart to try to make sure that, whatever questions you have, I'm going to see the best I can to try to, deal with it. I don't even know where to go with it. Um, and I know that there were a couple people have commented, this guy doesn't really seem to know a lot. He says, I don't know too much, or he doesn't know this, that. I really don't know how to deal with this particular, issue. And so I'm going to say that the writer is not concerned about that tension. And I know that some scholars are going to argue, oh, well, this is because the writer has got two strands of tradition that he's trying to tie together and they're contradictory. And my response to that, no, I don't think the writer's concerned about the issue like we are. And so I've got to I'm just going to stick with the tension.
Mm.
I can see you're satisfied, but
Yeah. Yeah. So then where for you, like, where else do we see, and for people listening, like, beyond Genesis 6, where else are we seeing the Nephilim come up
by the way,
throughout
well,
Scripture?
before I get there, I'd like to go to the New Testament um, because if I don't go to the New Testament, then it almost doesn't matter where I find the Nephilim in other places. Okay, because in fact, what really bothered me with this passage is that I couldn't get over the fact that it was pretty obvious that Second Peter and Jude are interpreting this passage in pretty much the same way I'm interpreting it. In other words, I'm getting it from them. And since I hold that they are divinely inspired scripture, I'm going there, even if it looks a little embarrassing to the modern mindset. And I think that's the problem. And I think that's the problem. It's been since in the Christian view, since Augustine. I think Augustine, who loved the Bible and he loved Greek philosophy, he was a little embarrassed to interact with his uh, his colleagues, secular or otherwise, or pagan or otherwise, and try to explain the fact that we've got some mythical stuff here that looks a lot like the mythical stuff that you guys have, but um, and so I think he tried to explain it away. I don't know whether I have an Augustine quote here or not that I can get to quickly. Um, Probably I'm gonna take a few seconds. If I can get to it fast. No, I don't have it fast. And so but he starts to try to rationalize it in the mid 4th century, well, 5th century, early 5th century. And because he was such a dominant intellect, um, for many of the right reasons, uh, Augustinian thinking really became the product of the Middle Ages, and it really wasn't uh, superseded. I'm thinking until, especially in Christendom, until the scientific revolution. So anyway, I've got to go to the New Testament, and because the New Testament writers interpret this, and the way they interpret it, they're going to say, "We're not doing anything special. We're not doing it. We're not giving you anything that's new. We're giving you the traditional interpretation, which we find even in the early church up until Augustine." And so let's first go to Second Peter for a minute. And by the way, without Jude, Second Peter wouldn't be a proof text. In other words, you have to look at both of them. And I also think, by the way, whoever wrote Second Peter and whoever wrote Jude shared a brain. It doesn't mean they're the same author, but they've got very much the same context. In fact, Second Peter is much more like Jude than it is like First Peter. And of course, the tradition is, of course, that Peter wrote the first two, and I'm not going to quibble over that. I'm not a New Testament scholar to argue with that, but it's sort of interesting. So here we are in Second Peter. What's Peter's goal? Is that he's like many of these authors, he's trying to help the early church try to weather the great storm of persecution. And if you're able to weather the storm, it'll show that you're a true believer. And so you got to watch out, especially for these guys that are false teachers. And so here we are in Peter, Second Peter 2. Let's start with verse 1 just for a second to get context. I know this is sort of long and drawn out. So he says, but false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, um, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so um, not that it's not important, it's just not important for our context. In other words, he's saying, don't be surprised if there are false teachers. They've come and gone. And so let me even explain it. They're even in the Bible. And so verse 3, and in these false teachers in their greed, they'll exploit you with false words. But their judgment from long ago is not idle. Their destruction is not asleep. In other words, don't worry, they're going to get theirs. And then verse 4, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, when did the angels sin? I mean, I don't know what you're talking about. Who are the angels? By the way, the angels are usually, what's the term angel? Though it's simply the word for messenger, in the context, it's talking about heavenly messengers, not earthly ones, okay? Even though it's the same word. Uh, but cast them into hell. Now, of course, we're not told that in in Genesis, and committed them into pits of darkness and reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah. In other words, it's almost as if the writer's looking at the Genesis 6 passage, and he says, right, there's the first part. And then now I'm going to talk about the flood part, and then I'll move on a little bit further in order to Genesis 19 and of course, what's all this? It's sexual sin is what the common theme as you go on. And of course, and then, and so, and so this sensuality is what's being described here. And of course, you're thinking, well, how do we know that these angels being described in Second Peter are the ones that are described in Genesis 6, where it talks about the sons of God? Well, it's usually the term that is often used in the New Testament for heavenly beings. Then you got to go to Jude, okay, just a couple of verses down. And where do we want to go in Jude? Uh, Jude's only one book, and so we got, verse 5. Um, Now, I desire to remind you, though, you know all things once and for all, that the Lord, after saving the people out of the land of Egypt, destroyed those who did not believe. And then he says the same thing. And angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode. What does that mean? Well, you put it together with Peter and you put it together with Genesis, it seems to be talking about the sons of God who, what did they do? They came down and began to impregnate daughters of men. And of course, here we're being given the interpretive framework that this was going against the divine nature. In other words, this isn't what was supposed to happen. Okay. And so they abandon their proper abode. He has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Okay, so, and then he talks about, again, gross immorality with Sodom and Gomorrah. It's almost as if he's giving us the same themes that are given by the writer of 2 Peter. And by the way, they're both probably getting this from a common source, which is not a biblical source, by the way, which might be unnerving about people. But, even biblical writers read other books too. I mean, that'd be like Keegan saying, "Hey, Mark, really read this really cool book the other day. It's a Christian book. It's about some guy named C.S. Lewis." And if my answer was, "Wait a minute, that's not the Bible. Why are you reading it?" Well, I got something out of it. Okay, but watch out because it's not the same as the Bible. And Keegan probably would answer like, "Yeah, duh. I kind of figured that one out." So in other words, the biblical writers are doing the same thing. They're reading Jewish literature in that period. So what are they reading? Well, we actually get the answer a couple verses down in Jude. Verse 14. Um, so all of these men who are sensual and false teachers and all these bad guys who are leading people astray, verse 14, it was also these men that Enoch in the seventh generation from Adam prophesied, saying, "Behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all." And I'm not going to read the rest of it, but he's quoting a source. And if you start looking for that source in the Bible, you're not going to find it. It happens to be an extra biblical source written in between the two Testament. It is known presently as 1 Enoch. Now, I don't want to go into a dissertation about Enoch. I'm not an Enoch scholar. I will tell you that, of course, if you go to the Ethiopian church, they've always accepted Enoch as inspired. There were some early church scholars, including Tertullian and others, that would quote Enoch. I don't believe any of them actually gave it a thumbs up for being divinely inspired, but they weren't shy about quoting it because it had really cool information in it that was helpful and useful. I suppose it would be as if um, I don't know, let's say we're talking about George Washington in the cherry tree, and I've got the official version here, which is pretty brief, and it simply talks about the fact that when he was a boy, he couldn't tell a lie and he cut the tree down and he got in trouble for it, but that just showed his great character. And you've got extra information. And my answer would be, well, no, but the information that you have isn't in here. And so I can't use it. And you're saying, wait, wait, wait. No, it's actually helpful. It provides a context for it. Um, but it's not part of the received, version. And that's what's going on here. Enoch is being quoted by the writer of Jude, and of course he actually quotes it more than once, or at least addresses it more than once. Does this mean that Enoch was the author of it? Maybe I'll talk about when I talk about authorship, and I'll just give you a little hint. Authorship in the ancient Near Eastern world, the text. If I have a text in front of you, they're going to first talk about the text, and then who wrote the text was secondary and subordinate. When you get to the classical world, the first thing they ask is who wrote this. Then they ask about the content of the text. And so the ancient Near Eastern writers, including the biblical text, they were more text oriented. And this is why we have hardly any information about who wrote any of the texts in the Bible, like who wrote Ruth, who wrote Jonah, who wrote, Judges, et cetera. They're all, a lot of them are quite anonymous for a good reason, is because they wanted it to be text oriented and connected to God. So did Enoch actually write um, first Enoch? Well, I think a biblical answer would be Enoch probably had something to do with the original part of it, but it was handed down and made applicable to each generation. So here we are 20, 30, 50 generations later, and now here's the relevant information that we have in first Enoch. So did Enoch write it? The answer is yes and no. And maybe a second, a scholar who's a little more critical about it would say maybe it's all no. I don't know, but it doesn't really matter because it has content in there that was useful to the writers. It doesn't mean that I look at Enoch, say, wow, this is really cool information. Let me pull all that information here and attach it to here. No, I use First Enoch because it provides really good and interesting context for understanding my Bible better, not because it has such a powerful source of information. It could be wrong about lots of things. I don't know who the final author slash editor of Enoch is. In fact, it seems to be a strand of a couple of different texts that were woven together by an anonymous Enoch author, editor, redactor sometime a century or two before Christ. And of course, second and third and fourth, the other Enochs, I don't even want to talk about because they don't have the content that we're looking at. It's first Enoch. But it was such a powerful book that, like I said, the Ethiopian church it did and continues to hold it as inspired scripture. So let's just take it um, with some seriousness, but not to the point of of canonicity, I suppose. And of course, that brings up a whole lot of questions that that I would prefer not to answer. I'm going to pause for a second because I'm sure that there's a question percolating before I look
A couple questions, yeah. So the first one would be, what would you say, so using Second Peter, using Jude, to those that say, well, the angels sinned, yeah, he's just talking about the fall, right? What we see later with Satan, he brings a third of the angels with him, or a big amount of them with. Well, yeah, they sinned, right? Because it's probably a bad example, but I've at least heard rumblings of that as an argument to why it's not actual angelic human hybrid type
I
giant.
I would rather believe that, by the way. I think it would be easier to believe that. But there are a couple problems with it. First of all, it means that a simple reading of the text I can look at Peter and Jude and say, "Oh, I think I know what they're doing. They're actually looking at Genesis right now, and they're going in order. They're looking at the early parts of Genesis 6, and they're going down to Genesis, and by the way, they're not only looking at Genesis 6, they're adding midrash. In other words, they're adding informed interpretive information about this passage that's more than just what the passage has there. Okay. And since he's talking about the fact that what's the sin in Jude and what's the sin in Peter? It's false teachers who have sensuality as one of their cores, and they're taking advantage of people through it. And if that's the case, then this fits perfectly with Genesis 6. And I don't and my first reaction is my first reaction was I don't like that. This seems to be a little embarrassing, but it's the best interpretation. It's the one that makes the most sense in terms of literary analysis. And I'm going to let everybody else figure out how to deal with that because I don't know how to deal with that. All I know how to deal with is how to interpret the text and let other people worry about what the ramifications are. Because if this is all I had, I'd say, yeah, let's quibble over this. But we're not even. I haven't even scratched the surface yet in
Mm.
terms of this stuff.
Yeah, and I know in other episodes we'll probably go into other ancient Near Eastern comparisons, in terms of other texts that mention giants or things that could be related to the Nephilim. But as part of the issue that the way Peter talks about it, the way Jude talks about it, the way Genesis talks about it, they just say Nephilim, and then we're left saying, "Well, who the heck are the Nephilim?" And A, they don't care about that question, perhaps, or it's so common to them that is everybody knows who the like, I just say Nephilim. Everybody knows who the Nephilim
I
are.
think the second answer is probably what's going on because, spoiler alert, Goliath is probably one of these guys. You know, the writer I think makes some brilliant hints to let you know that Goliath is one of these guys, and so we'll get there at some point. Um,
Yeah.
um,
Then I guess my other one would just be I have some more, but
Good.
what are the other main arguments or positions aside from it being angelic human hybrids? Like, what are the other
I,
options out
I,
there?
you see, I've almost forgotten what they are. I guess they argue that these are two lines, the line of Seth and the line of Cain, that are coming together. And I suppose you really have to do a lot of, and this is the one that I think is Augustinian, is that all right? Well, it just happened in Genesis 4. We've got the Cainite geology, then we have the Sethite geology in 5, and so let's mix the two together, and maybe that's what they're talking about. And my answer is, yeah, I wish I could believe that, but I don't think the text allows that. I think you've got to do too many mental gymnastics to get there because you don't like the inevitable idea that heavenly beings are coming to down and impregnating earthly beings. That does I don't know about you, but that really does not appeal to my modern sensibilities at all.
Yeah, because isn't that the main argument? And you'd brought it up, and I can't remember specifically what verse it is, but it's talking about the angels in heaven don't marry.
Right.
And so, but which my response to that is neither do we when we get up there. Or
Well,
I guess
yes.
if Jesus returned first, but like we are no longer in a marriage
That's
covenant.
the whole point of that passage, and so it's not Jesus is not giving us a treatise on the nature of heavenly beings and what they do with each other, and what they can and can't do with each other. That's quite irrelevant. I'm gonna take a wild guess that if you're a heavenly being and you take on human form, you can probably do human things. I who knew?
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. So that would be the Sethite view. And then your thoughts on, or maybe your argument against the other one, which would be that they just mean giants. That it's not necessarily heavenly being and human hybrids, not hybrid giants, but literally just men of renown, like the ancient heroes of the day, which an argument, which we had talked about this before the episode was, one of the arguments is the way that that's worded. men of old. Let me get that. Well, it's the men of renown, but it talks about in those days and also afterward. Basically, the argument would be like linguistically that can be applied, and it's read in a way of the Nephilim giants. Giants were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. When the sons of God, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them, they were the heroes of old, men of renown. Like they were before this event of the angels coming and consummating, and they were there after. They're saying linguistically it can be read that
I
way.
suppose my answer to that would be maybe the writer has a severe case of ADD. Is like he's on one topic and he just went off topic for a minute, then got back on topic. It's like, well, that's really special. The giants were there. There's nothing in the Bible that's ever random. If it gives you a seemingly random statement, it has really powerful meaning, either right there or later on. And there's nothing else later on in Genesis 6 that informs you about what these guys, are. And so I'm going to take a wild guess that the Nephilim must be connected to the heavenly beings and the earthly beings, which would make them the products of it, which I think is pretty obvious since it's mentioned twice, in that narrative. Um, and it just doesn't take rocket science, uh, to figure out that that you think about it. Look at verse 4 again. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore to them, and those were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Who were? I gotta guess it must have been the Nephilim, and the Nephilim must be connected to the product of the two. That's a simple reading that I think that I would probably get. Uh, if you gave this to a 6-year-old to read and they understood all the words, and you would ask them, "So who are the Nephilim?" "Oh, they're the guys from the sons of God and the daughters of men." In other words, that's the simple reading of the text, and I don't wanna use mental gymnastics to try to go elsewhere. That's I think you have to really work hard to make it mean something else. And the men of renown, the mighty men, that can be used for heavenly beings, earthly beings, sub-earthly beings. It context will tell you what they are. It doesn't that particular word doesn't tell you anything any more than I looked up the Akkadian word for watcher to see if it's like the word for Daniel. And guess what? Watchers can be angelic and they can be non-angelic. In other words, they can be earthly. It's like, oh, just like the word watcher in English. If I talked about watchers to you, you're saying, use it in a sentence, like it's just sort of a generic word. Uh,
Yeah.
and I'm,
So then what is the is there anything more to that phrase, the heroes of old? Because again, I get from your perspective, but if I'm, you know, arguing from the other side, which is I'm saying that these giants were before and after, well, then I'm also viewing it in that lens. And so to me, that verse is gonna even give me more like even more validation. Well, they're the heroes of old, the men of renown. Like it's the heroes you've always been hearing about. That it's just these big, strong, powerful giants, which I don't like arguments that can easily be made for the other case as well. Goliath being potentially we won't touch on that right now, but potentially being a Nephilim, like, well, yeah, the Nephilim are demon hybrid giants too. Like, I'm sure they were pretty strong and good fighters.
yeah, I mean, the thing is, the writer, you think about it, if this is, let's just say this is immediately Mosaic right here. That means he's talking to a late Bronze audience, and of course, the Nephilim are going to be discussed a little bit later in a couple isolated passages. But think about it. Whenever the Nephilim are being discussed, they're never the main topic. It's an aside. You know why it's an aside? Because everybody knows it. It's not, it doesn't need to be addressed. The Nephilim are never the central piece of anything. They're not the central piece here. That's the other problem, is that the whole point of the first 4 verses in this passage are to prepare you for the big event, and that's the flood. How did the flood get here? Oh, it's because of this big problem that we have where heavenly creatures are violating their natural domain. That's how it's interpreted by the divinely inspired New Testament writers, writer of Jude. And so I'm going to take a stab that I probably should interpret it that way too. By the way, I fought this for a decade, and I kept on coming back to, all right, God, what do I do with the fact that Jude and Second Peter talk about it? And I think it's pretty obvious that they're talking about this topic. Okay, that looks embarrassing, but I'm gonna go with it. And where is it gonna take me? It took me deep into Mesopotamia, which we won't get to on this podcast. It'll probably be next time, but it's gonna take me there. But before we get there, we'll have to get back to Enoch and to other places to see how this is understood in terms of intertestamental Jewish tradition. They would answer, "Oh yeah, we know all about this stuff. We don't need." And even though the fact that it's been embellished, the embellishment isn't divinely inspired, but it does tell me where their interpretive head is at. And so it helps me understand what people are thinking and how they interpret this passage. And so, and that helps me understand it.
Yeah, so I guess my one sidebar, I have another question, but it's just been kind of gnawing at me, would be verse 3 in Genesis 6, where it says, "Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with you." Well, I'm reading the NIV. "Will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be no," and I know you touched on will, will be numbered to 120. I guess me as like a Bible reader, what is it talking about? His spirit won't contend with them. So I get it. Okay, he numbers them at 120. But what's the part before that talking about?
Before, uh,
Before the 120, I'm
oh,
kind of just focused on like part A of that.
that
My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are more. Like, what is he?
I that is
What are you talking
that
about?
has also defied easy interpretation, which I just think that's like, wow, I said that again today, like 10 times a day. It seems like I have to say that, but it's interpretive. The interpretive mode for this one has been contentious for 2 millennia, shock of all shocks. And so it's not like I'm going to be giving you anything, uh, you know,
No answers then,
well,
huh?
it's not no definitive answers, and so I'm gonna take my stab here is that when God is contending with, in other words, I'm not going to fight with this. And of course, when it says he strives, what does the word Israel mean? Striving with God. In other words, contending with God. And so here, I'm not going to contend, and then his days will be 120. And now, of course, here's the interpretive argument, and I don't know which answer is better. Is he talking about the fact that humans will only live to be 120, or they've only got 120 years to figure this out? Okay, which I suppose you could say is 3 generations. I'm kind of thinking it's the second one, but I wouldn't be, if somebody gave me a strong argument that no, it means you're only going to be living 120 after this. Although the problem is that that's not true. They live longer than that, and so that's why I'm sort of leaning towards the second one. That when God's saying this, he's giving them, and God's patient, he's giving them 3 full generations to figure this out.
Hmm.
Is
So kind of like God's frustration, which we see later in Genesis, where he's like, a little bit like upset and regretting making
yeah,
mankind.
I'm
So
gonna
he's
I wanna do a podcast on that too, that word for regret or whatever, naham,
that's why I put it in
yeah.
quotes. Just I set you up. I put it in quotes for
Yeah,
you.
we're gonna deal with that one of these days.
Yeah.
Because
And so I guess then my next one would be, do you see what we're seeing in Genesis 6 as another major event of rebellion? Because most people read in it's just Genesis, well, I guess 1, 2, and 3, right? The fall of mankind is the great rebellion, and then all evil and all sin and everything is just an effect of this one rebellion. Or are you more on the Mike Heiser and other people who see this as a second rebellion of what's happening, right? So we have the fall of Adam and Eve. Well, this would be another rebellion where the angels come and they intermingle and have sex with human women and create these hybrids. And so God's going to now respond to this again, this second rebellion, so to speak.
yeah, um, all I'm gonna tell you is that, I've looked through Mike's arguments, and they are in many respects above my pay grade in the sense that I'm really content to find out what the Mesopotamian weeds say about this stuff to make these connections. The theological ramifications um, are overwhelming to me. And so, whether or not this is another full scale rebellion, all I can tell you is that the early church uh, interpreted that way, but they did not make a big deal about it. And I'm kind of, I kind of understand why not. The Bible doesn't make a big deal about it in the sense that in a sense this rebellion is putting our rebellion into a bigger context. In other words, here we are, we're fighting a war. We committed treason against God in Genesis 3. Okay. And we're understandably very concerned about this particular issue. How do we get back right with God in terms of this treason? But God's saying, actually, there's a much bigger war. Yeah, this is not a one front war. There's a much bigger deal going on. But I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about it because it would blow your head gasket. But I'm going to give you a few hints here and there that there's a much bigger war going on. Treason is much more pervasive than simply you little dust creatures down there. It's actually a heavenly issue, and I'm going to give you a few hints about it here and there but if I told you too much about it, I think that you couldn't bear it. And of course, that's really what has happened. And so when I've read what Mike writes, he tries to put all the pieces together, and I have to tell you is that it's not that I'm not that I'm critical about it, it's that I haven't been able to work through all the puzzle pieces yet to be convinced that it's all there. He really worked a lot, and I respect him greatly, and so I'm gonna look at it and say, "Yeah, that looks pretty good," but since I'm not a theologian, and again, that was the beauty of somebody like Mike Kaiser. He starts off with a deep training in theology, and then he goes into historical studies, and so it's as if he did the full gamut in both camps, and then put them together as if he's this two-headed academic monster, and I'm saying that in the best way possible. And so when he has got when he has that theological hat on, I'm thinking, "Whoa, that's overwhelming." When he has the academic, the historical hat on, I'm say, "Yeah, I can understand that." And I will quibble with a detail here and a detail there. We might even get to them here and there. Uh, but I'm overwhelmed by the other one, and so I'm looking at that and thinking, I don't see anything that's a red flag because even though I'm not trained in theology, I've sort of been exposed to it since I was 4 years old, and so I'm pretty convinced, and I think I should be responsible for knowing my faith theology as an evangelical believer, Bible believing believer, and so I see that, and so when I read what Mike has written about it, um, I have not seen any sharp red flags, only tiny little pinprick details that I might tweak.
Got it. Well, awesome. Yeah, I think at least for this part, that kind of wraps up some of my questions. But you guys that are listening, please help fill in the gaps. If you guys have questions, as always, please put them in the comments below. But I think this is a good place to stop for this episode. And so maybe give a little teaser. I mean, I think we're going to be kind of giving even more, a wider lens as to who these Nephilim are by looking at Mesopotamian and other, probably some other texts as well. And so why don't you give everybody a little bit of a teaser for the next
A
episode?
couple of places I want to go. First of all, I want to take a look at First Enoch. There are a couple of chapters that expand upon this very greatly, and I'm telling you that since Jude quotes Enoch, that means he's well aware of the expanded tradition concerning Genesis 6. And this is why, in other words, you've got to take this puzzle piece, and this puzzle piece, and this puzzle piece, and then to put them together to create this theological narrative. And so I think if I look at Enoch, it doesn't mean that I accept Enoch uncritically. It means that I accept that Enoch is presenting a tradition that is well understood by the New Testament writers. Then and then I'll look at the passages, the isolated passages about the Nephilim. There aren't very many of them, by the way. And whoever they are, the writer assumes that the listener knows all about them, and you have to make connection after connection to get from point A, Nephilim in Genesis 6, to, let's say, Goliath, or let's say Og, King Og, who's got this giant bed. And another teaser, Og's giant bed is the same dimensions as the bed of the divine Marduk in Mesopotamia. What does that mean? Well, people have made this outlandish claim. Well, that means that Og is a divine being. My answer is no, it doesn't, and I'll explain why it doesn't. And then to finish this off, and this might be the second part, I'm going to go into Mesopotamia first with a source that we've always had, but it's in bad shape. Berosus, who's a classical writer who talks about these hybrid beings, the product of heavenly beings and earthly beings. And then we're going to go deep into Mesopotamian texts because the Nephilim, I believe, are mentioned. They're called the Apkallu in Mesopotamia. I'm not the first one to bring that up. And Draftcorn Kilmer did this in the late 1980s. And then I'm going to come up with a little teaser to finish this off. This is actually after Mike wrote this, and unfortunately, he probably didn't see this book before he passed away, but it was published 3 years ago. A lady by the name of Josephine Fechner wrote "In Search of the Seven Sages of Mesopotamia." The word for sage is Apkallu, and she writes a 600-page book on the Mesopotamian Apkallu. And guess how many pages there are about the Nephilim? 4 out of 600. And I'll be describing that. But if you put all the pieces together, I think it's obvious that they're talking about the same thing. And when the biblical writers are talking about the Nephilim, they know the Apkallu tradition and in Genesis 6, and they're basically rewriting the history to show you that you've heard this about this event, and let me tell you the divinely inspired truth about it. In the same way that we're reading the Genesis 1 passage about creation, you know the Mesopotamian story, we're gonna tell you the real story. You've heard about the fall, we'll tell you the real story. You've heard about the flood, let me give you the account that that understands it from a standpoint of a divine being who's wholly apart from the universe. And so Genesis 6 has its same Mesopotamian counterpart. And when I figured that one out, that was, for me, hook, line, and sinker. The passage has been interpreted correctly.
Well, boom. Can't wait.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Again, make sure to like and subscribe below. Let us know if you guys have some questions, or if you want to, not publicly comment them, but you have questions. We'll attach our email below. Feel free to reach out to us. Mark would love to discuss and engage with you. And so, yeah, until next time, the Nephilim.